So why Espathra EX? Well, Espathra EX is one of those control decks that do actually take prizes. It gets to swing for weakness into some top meta decks such as Charizard EX, Roaring Moon, Ancient Box, because it has the ability where your opponent needs an extra energy on their active Pokemon to attack. It's enough to kind of steal turns completely from your opponent if they're unable to attack. Say they are able to get that extra attachment on board, we have other ways to try and slow them down. This deck is a slow and steady wins the race kind of deck. However, you can be the aggressor by building up enough energies on your Espathra to go for some big one-shot attacks, or you can also do some other attacks with a Pokemon we have in this deck, Banette EX. Just a disclaimer, this version of the deck I'm showing you guys I played at Baltimore Regionals. Now, the reason I chose this deck for Baltimore Regionals is because I was expecting a very large amount of Charizard, Roaring Moon, and Ancient Box players. I could have played Miraidon and did like a safe kind of bet, a comfort pick. However, I wasn't going to be able to do too much testing and practicing leading up to this regional event, and so I decided to cope and try and go the control route by doing this play instead. So because I wasn't able to spend some extra time teching this deck out accordingly, I just went for a max consistency build, which is honestly never a bad idea, to just go with the most consistent way to build your deck so that you're playing the most amount of games. Now I will be talking about the matchup spread for this deck and basically the big changes or the changes I wish I made and the changes I'll be making going into the Stellar Crown format that will still make this deck very, very playable. This deck isn't completely dead by any means, so with that said, let's just dive right into the deck profile. Starting things off with the Pokemon, we have 3 copies of Flittle. Now there are like 5 or 6 different versions of Flittle available. However, this is the one I chose because it has free retreat. Being able to pivot on your turn 1 is very, very important. Next, we have 3 copies of Espathra EX. One really nice thing is that it is a Terra type Pokemon, so it does have bench protection built in. 260 HP, which isn't a crazy amount, however, it is just a stage 1. So, you know, from going from 30 HP to 260, feels pretty good. We have the ability here, Dazzling Gaze. So it reads here, as long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, attacks used by opponent's active Pokemon cost 1 energy more. So this is very, very strong against particular decks that aren't able to flood the board with a lot of energies at once. Say you're playing something like a Lost Box deck and they have just the amount of energies and Mirage Gates to you know, get their regular attack going, but they need an extra one, which is really, really annoying. Another option is if you're playing against something like Charizard. If they use Infernal Rain and they forget that you have this ability in play, if they only put 2, then they're not able to attack with their Charizard EX anymore. You can rest easy that you just stole the turn off them because they are probably a newer player who forgot about this ability. One nice thing too in this matchup against Charizard is if the Charizard attacks you, it's going to have 3 energies on board, and you can one-shot Charizard by having 2 energies on the Espathra. Very easy to return one-shot a Charizard, and also if you're playing cards like a Super Effective Glasses, for example, because I did play Espathra with Scizor at one point when Shen Pao was more of a relevant deck, then you could just Arven for Super Effective Glasses and swing into Charizard for weakness times 3. Psyball is a psychic attack cost right here, and its retreat cost here is also 1, which is really handy, so you can just have your Espathra run away if it didn't get hit by a one-shot attack. The fact that this is such an easy card to set up and start attacking and start using your control style abilities is really, really annoying. Some decks are able to keep up with it, but if you're not able to get those extra energies on board, stealing those turns just feels really, really evil and diabolical. Next up, we have 3 copies of Natu. Natu is our draw engine, or I should say Xatu. 3 copies of Xatu. So if you're familiar with Shadow Rider Calyrex VMAX, it has the exact same ability where you basically get to attach an energy card from your hand to a bench Pokemon. It has to be psychic energy though, and you get to draw 2 cards. So Xatu pairs very well with all of your attackers in this deck because the attack costs are very cheap, so you're able to just kind of bring out Surprise Espathra with 1 to 3 energies or a bunch of energies at once and swing big. 3 copies because it is not only just our draw engine, but it's also our energy acceleration engine as well. So skipping down to a 2-2 line can heavily punish you. I would highly recommend sticking with a 3-3 line. Next up, we have 2 copies of Shuppet, our friendly ghost. It has 1 attack which comes up sometimes called Enveloping Shadow. It does 10 damage for 1 psychic, and you flip a coin for item lock. If heads, your opponent can't play any items. But our typical turn 1 attack we want to make with this deck is we want to either attack with Cleffa for the Grasping Jaw, or attack with anything at all with the Evolution TM. Shuppet item lock, it's an option here. It's available, but what we're really doing here is evolving into Banette and Banette EX. So I should preface that this list was heavily inspired by Braden Elfert, a fantastic rogue deck player who piloted Espathra EX to a really high placement at the European International Championships last year. On screen will be his list that you guys can take a look at and also use as a base for your own Espathra list. So this Banette is very good. It basically allows you to grab any supporter from your discard pile and add it to your hand. So if your bench is looking pretty good, you can start setting up the Shuppet to evolve into this Banette later on. So you can use a Bosses on demand or Iono on demand. Also, when you use the ability for Banette, it just goes to the Lost Zone, so you free up your bench spot right after. Another option is you have the Banette EX that actually attacks. So this one is quite weak, but it does have some very strong attacks. First up, you have 250 HP on the stage 1 Pokemon, Everlasting Darkness. For 1 Psychic, it does 30 damage and it item locks your opponent. That means they can't play any ball cards, any item cards at all that's going to help accelerate their board state. They can't play cards like Rare Candy, so it's really annoying, and that 30 damage might not be much, but that item lock is what the real thing is. That's the real threat of the attack. And you're basically softening up your opponent's Pokemon so you can use Poltergeist to do a big attack, because for 1 Psychic and 1 Colorless, you get to look at your opponent's hand and you do 60 damage for each trainer card in their hand. So if you're already item locking them going into this attack, you can kind of guarantee they're going to have at least some items, so you're setting up a big Poltergeist attack. This Pokemon is very clutch for doing some big one-shot KOs, but also you can kind of cheese some matchups by just item locking your opponent, and then eventually you just bring out your Espathra EX and you finish them off with that Pokemon. One downside to Banette, it is the only Pokemon in this deck that has a 2 retreat cost, so do keep that in mind. And there are going to be instances where you prize it and it's going to feel horrible, but that just comes with the nature of the deck, because Banette isn't the main attacker of this deck, Espathra is. Next up, we have 1 copy of Mimikyu. Very strong Pokemon. It can steal turns as well if your opponent doesn't have an answer to it. This is a really strong card in the Raging Bolt EX matchup. Sometimes you can steal turns, especially if they're not able to set up their little baby Sandy Shocks, or if they prize their Sandy Shocks or something like that. Also, 7 damage counters is really nice to throw on, but this pairs well for a defensive play, and then you slap on the Evo TM and evolve your benched Pokemon. So Mimikyu is really annoying. Some decks you can kind of just steal a win if they bench lock themselves out of being able to have a Pokemon that can attack Mimikyu. Next up, we got Cleffa in here as well for free retreat and the Grasping Draw attack. You're usually able to whittle your hand down to a pretty low hand size, so being able to refill it with Cleffa is very handy. And there is another Pokemon that was in consideration for this deck. UEX is a really solid option as well. It is a 2 prizer though, so you just have to keep that in mind, but you do have the restart ability with UEX, and you can also steal your opponent's attacks with the genome hacking. The 3 attack cost is sometimes a little harder to set up if you're doing Zatus to build up the attack. However, some builds will also play a double turbo energy, so all you could do is, throw on a DTE and Clairvoyance Sense once, and your MUEX is attacking. Last but not least, we have 1 copy of Manaphy for some bench protection. One of the harder matchups for this deck is Regidrago V-Star with the Kyurem attack, because it can basically board wipe your Pokemon for 110 on 3 different Pokemon. So Manaphy is very strong to help protect you against that. It also helps protect you against Radiant Greninja, whatever decks still attack with those. It's just nice to have some built-in bench protection. If you don't end up using it, Manaphy is just kind of a dead card, or a card you can even throw in to the active and attack with Evo TM, if so be it. Now, I will mention, after we run through the rest of the cards of this deck, there's quite a few different Pokemon cards that you can tech to beat other matchups that are going to be more and more relevant going into Stellar Crown format. So stick around for that if you want to think about playing this deck, because this deck is really cheap, it's really fun to play, and it is an anti-meta deck. So if you're in a local area where people are playing particular decks, then you can kind of read the room and tech your Espathra accordingly. 10 basic psychic energies. You want to have only these because Zatu is able to charge up the basic energies. You can run the double turbo energy. That's just 1 less energy that Zatu won't be able to throw onto your Pokemon. Next up, we got the supporters. Our main supporter in this deck is going to be Arven. Your main targets very early into the game are going to be cards like Buddy Buddy Poffin and Evo TM. And say if your hand is already full of Buddy Buddy Poffins, sometimes you're low on energy, so instead of grabbing a Buddy Buddy Poffin, you might want to grab something like an Earthen Vessel, or even a Hyper Aroma for the future turns. You're always going to try and grab Evo TM turn 1, but if you don't, there's a couple other tools in this deck. You really want to get this deck set up as quick as possible, get those Zatus on the board, and at least try and get 1 Flittle established so your Espathra can start swinging. 4 copies of Iono. Iono really strong. You could cut down the Ionos from 4. The other draw supporter in this deck we have is Professor's Research, so you could play around with the research to Iono count. The Arven count you want to keep at 4 no matter what. But yeah, this is kind of flexible. We do have 1 research in here. We do have recovery in this deck, so you could honestly cut this down to maybe like 2 Iono, 3 research, 3 Iono, 2 research. I believe Braden Alfred's build is way more turbo in a sense, where they have a whole bunch of researches instead, and they have the super rods for recovery, 2 copies of Boss's Orders. Now do keep in mind, we do have 2 copies of Boss's Orders, which may seem low for some people, but we also have the Bennett package in here as well, so if we need to reuse a research or reuse a Boss's Orders, we can search it out with the Bennett. Another thing to keep in mind is because we do have 2 Boss's Orders and our other supporter lineup is looking heavily on the Iono side with 1 research, say if we were to have more researches in the deck and we were stuck with Boss's Orders and we have to research, we're losing out on some critical Boss's Order cards. So this is why I decided to have the supporter count that I particularly did. Stadium of choice for this deck is Pokemon League Headquarters. You typically are going to be playing against a lot of big basics out there as well, so by having Pokemon League Headquarters on the field along with an Espathra in the active, it's going to force your opponent's active Pokemon to need 2 extra energies to attack, which is a lot to deal with. One issue I had with playing against the 3 different Raging Bolt players I did at Baltimore is I did beat one of them, but the other 2, every single time I played Pokemon League Headquarters, my opponent had Pokestop instantly. So my whole stall tactic of Espathra plus League Headquarters never really worked. Sometimes you just get unlucky like that. Also, if you are forced to go first, dropping this in turn 1 is really handy. Onto our tools, we have 1 copy of Rigid Band. Basically, it makes your Pokemon have 30 more HP, or it does 30 less damage to your Pokemon if it's a stage 1. So this will pair well, of course, with Espathra EX, effectively making you 290 HP. This is a very important number to hit, especially against decks like Raging Bolt or Regidrago V-Star, or just other decks in general. Being able to get to 290 HP makes you not one-shottable in certain instances. For example, Regidrago V-Star has to copy Lost Impact. That's only 280. This is a 290 HP Pokemon all of a sudden with Rigid Band. We also have 1 copy of Rescue Board. Rescue Board, of course, all these cards are searchable by the 4 copies we have of Arven, but Rescue Board is just a basically free switching card. And our last tool for this deck is Technical Machine Evolution. There is an argument that you might want to put 2 in here, but we do have an Ace Spec in here, which is pretty good at evolving your Pokemon too. So Technical Machine Evolution, the go-to grab turn 1 playing Arven, so you can start playing it and evolving your Pokemon and accelerating your board state. It can be on anything. Just to keep in mind, you can't use the attack if you have your own Pokemon League Headquarters out, where there's some arguments, you know, it is nice to have the double turbo energy in your deck if you're going to use DTE and then use this to attack as well with League Headquarters out. Now on to the Ace Spec and the item cards. We have Hyper Aroma as our main item card to grab for Arven on our second Arven ideally, or first Arven if we are going first, and we were able to buddy pop in a bunch of our board state. Hyper Aroma says search your deck for up to 3 stage 1 Pokemon, reveal them, and put them into your hand. Very strong card for consistency. If Hyper Aroma wasn't the Ace Spec of choice, you could always play Hero's Cape. That is the second choice, and Prime Capture is pretty great as well. If you were gonna go without the Hyper Aroma, then you probably might want to have 2 copies of Technical Machine Evolution, just for that evolution consistency. Next up, we're going to talk about the item cards in this list, and then the changes you should make if you want to keep this deck staying competitive in the upcoming Stellar Crown meta. In terms of our items, again, I did say we are going for max consistency, so we have 1 Golden Nest Ball in here. This card is honestly a flexible kind of card. Probably would have changed it with something else if I had the chance to going into Baltimore, but I really wanted to just play the game and set up as much as I could. 4 copies of Buddy Poffin, the go-to item to grab in this deck if you're not grabbing anything else off of Arven. Everything in this deck is Buddy Poffinable, which feels fantastic. 4 copies of Ultra Ball. Ultra Ball lets you play the game, and playing the game is always good. 2 copies of Earthern Vessel, and dang, have these cards really risen in prices. It's kind of crazy. There's games where you want to Arven for an Earthern Vessel and you prize an Earthen Vessel, and it feels bad because sometimes you just don't have the energies in your hand, which can come up pretty often since you only have 10 energies. So having energy cards be searchable through Arven, through Earthen Vessel, very clutch. The fact that you get 2 is really good because you can Clairvoyance Sense twice, meaning you get to draw 4 cards and attach 2 extra energies with the help of just 1 vessel and 2 birds. 1 copy of Lost Vacuum. Lost Vacuum is really strong to bump some important tools your opponent might have, whether it be like an Ancient Booster Energy Capsule or a Hero's Cape, or just anything. Lost Vacuum is really strong. The fact that we have 4 Arven, we can search it on demand is very useful too. And if you do end up playing against a stall matchup and they bring up Manaphy, you instantly kind of lose because we have no switching options. So if you play against a Snorlax stall and they're trying to trap you, make sure you Lost Vacuum your Manaphy as soon as you can. Last but not least, before we get to the cards you would want to tech into this deck to keep it competitive, we have the recovery cards. We have 1 copy of Super Rod, and then last but not least, we have Night Stretcher as well. Being able to instantly grab a Pokemon or a basic energy from your discard is also very, very strong. Players could opt for 2 stretchers, no rods, or 2 rods, no stretchers. I decided to go for a hybrid. We're going to be giving away both of these Espathra to 1 lucky viewer. All you have to do is subscribe, hit that like button down below, and comment what your favorite activity is to do when you're outside touching grass. So to update this deck for some of the bad matchups that it has, the worst matchups this deck has is Lugia and Gardevoir. Those are the 2 hardest ones that come to mind, and by teching for Gardevoir, you're also going to be able to tech for Raging Bolt at the same time and basically make that an auto win, which is really handy. So the tech, if you're scared of Gardevoir, is you're going to want to play Farigiraf EX, and you'll probably want to do a 2-2 line of Farigiraf. You can cut out the Banette line and Shuffle line and go 2 Giraffic, 2 Farigiraf essentially. Farigiraf is a dark type attacker that uses 1 Psychic and a double Turbo Energy to attack. It has the ability to prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's basic Pokemon EX. So I know that doesn't help you in the Guardy matchup, but it does help you in the Raging Bolt matchup, along with any of those big basic matchups. The reason why this is also so good against Guardy is because you are hitting for weakness against Guardy, so all you have to do is boss into their Guardy with Farigiraf and swing for knockout, and then you also get to spread 30 damage onto your opponent's bench Pokemon, which is important because, as you know, Gardevoir decks like to inflict pain upon their own Pokemon and sometimes put them in knockout range. So Dirty Beam, you're going to be able to take a bonus prize card potentially. That's one thing this deck can't do. It can't really take bonus prize cards. However, Farigiraf does have that option available as well. And another thing, if you are going to continue, with this terrestrial theme, Espathra is also terrestrial Pokemon, we have the new card Briar. So Briar is another way to get bonus prize cards as well. Espathra is a Terra Pokemon, Farigiraf's a Terra Pokemon. So Briar says if your opponent has 2 prize cards left, if your Terra Pokemon takes knockout on their active Pokemon, specifically active, you get a bonus prize card. So just remember, Farigiraf, you're not going to get bonus prize cards for knocking out a bench Pokemon, but Briar does have some synergy in this deck, so you can throw in a copy of Briar for this list. So in retrospect, I decided to disrespect the Gardevoir decks going into Baltimore because it's like a deck that just doesn't see much play at all, but I ironically hit Jay round 1 playing Gardevoir, so I was crushed. He kind of ran away with it, being able to hit him use abilities like Monkey Dory and just throw damage counters at my Pokemon, then eventually devolve them as well. All my Flittles are 30 HP, right? So he just has to put 30, 30, 30, spread some damage counters on my board, and Devo for a board wipe. It was not a fun time against Guardian. Now, the funny thing is, too, if you guys watched the Baltimore Regionals, the finals was Gardevoir and Lugia. So the other bad matchup for Espathra is Lugia V-Star, and that's because they're able to accelerate energies from their deck as much as they want, essentially. So they have that, plus the power of Cincino being a 1 prizer to 0 prizer is really, really strong. So if you wanted to tech against Lugia, you're going to be throwing in the Mewtwo EX. This is also a card that's going to see its way into Miraidon decks, I'm sure you guys know about. But the fact that you have Mewtwo here, which is a lightning attacker, which takes psychic energies, is very, very strong. And Mewtwo EX has a very similar attack to Espathra. However, it has 10 base damage. However, it says this attack does 30 more damage for each psychic energy attached to all of your Pokemon. So it's really easy to flood your board with a bunch of psychic energy, and therefore Mewtwo EX can swing for some pretty big numbers, and you don't even have to swing that hard if you're swinging for weakness into, of course, Lugia or Lugia V-Star. Thick 2 retreat cost as well. Really quickly, we'll just go over some of the matchup spreads for this deck that were the case for the Shrouded Fable format. Stellar Crown, things are going to change, of course. You're going to want to adapt this list with the correct text that you can prepare for, especially with Raging Bolt being a huge deck. Farigiraf basically becomes an auto inclusion for this deck, because if they can't attack this, they just can't win. Regidrago V-Star is kind of a 50-50, slightly favored maybe for Regidrago. It's like a 55-45. It really comes down to if they're able to get their Kyurem out quick, and if you have your Manaphy prized or not. Dragapult EX does become an issue as well, but you kind of just have to really set up as fast as you can and hope that they're not able to hit their energy switches onto their Drago fast enough. Lugia Archeops, a really hard matchup for this deck. The way it's currently built, it was probably like a 80-20. It's just very unfavored into Lugia. However, with the help of Mewtwo, that might change going forward. Raging Bolt, I'd say it's like a 55-45, slightly in favor of Raging Bolt. Of course, we do have ways to slow them down. We got the Espathra, we have the Mimikyu, we have the Pokemon League headquarters, but sometimes Raging Bolt's just so consistent. It's really good at setting up, and if they're bumping your stadium every single time, your defensive attempts become kind of useless. Charizard EX, this deck is so good against Charizard. I say it's about a 75-25 against Charizard EX. The main concern against Charizard players is the Radiant Charizard. You're going to want to make sure you time your Pokemon League headquarters really well. You're also going to want to make sure your Espathras are one-shotting the Charizards every single time. Against Iron Thorns, you have a good matchup against Iron Thorns. Snorlax Doll is rough if they're able to get the Manaphy, but if they don't get the Manaphy, everything in your deck can attack, which is great. Roaring Moon and Ancient Box are basically auto wins, so really need to go into that. Rhydon EX can be a little scary if they're able to amp you 3 times, but if you're able to slow them down properly, it becomes basically a 50-50 or a 60-40 in favor of Espathra, just as long as you're able to get these Espathras up and running, making your opponent need those extra energies, so their generators really need to hit maybe 65-35 in favor of Espathra against Miraidon. But if they go second, if they hit the nuts, then you're kind of cooked if they amp you very much a whole bunch. Dragapult EX is another huge matchup that's going to be seen a lot in Stellar Crown, so if Dragapult EX becomes too popular, this deck is just kind of like unplayable. Dragapult EX is the worst matchup for this deck that I can think of in the next format, because it's popular and it just, the way it plays counters the way you play. If you want to see the Baltimore regional vlog where I played this exact deck, you can click on screen right here. If you want to see my Pittsburgh regional vlog where I played on stream, you can click here. If you want to see a Japan Pokemon vlog, click here. And if you want to subscribe, I love you. Hit that button right there, and I'll see you later.